Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this forum. My name is Sam Loney, and I'm the president of World Model United Nations Conference, Melbourne 2013. This event is being run in collaboration with WorldMun, and I thank Kim and the organizers and honorable speakers for being here today. WorldMun is the world's biggest international student conference, and after 22 years, it has finally found its way to the city of Melbourne. And it's great to have it here. Thank you very much. And the theme of the conference for WorldMun 2013 Melbourne is the Millennium Development Goals. And this week, as you all sit here, especially earlier this morning up till now, delegates were sitting there and discussing the deliberations on the post-2015 agenda. And because of this great collaboration, we're going to see some great talk here, and I'm looking really forward to it. And amongst you will be sitting some of the delegates who will be doing those deliberations on behalf of youth and young people everywhere. So this is a great event with a great crowd, great speakers, and great and big ideas. And thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Sam, and good evening, everyone. My name is Rob Moody. I'm Professor of Public Health at the University of Melbourne, and I'd love to welcome you all here to this evening's One Just World Forum, proudly supported by Fed Square. And Julia asked me if I'd ever done these before, and I said yes. The last time I did one of these, I actually introduced the moderator, so I've been promoted. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And many of you will have heard Auntie Joy Murphy and Auntie Di welcome you to country in such generous and warm and inclusive ways, which I can only try and attempt to do, but I guess those two are particularly wonderful symbols of the notion of how close Indigenous owners are to their land. And we believe that respecting the rights and contributions of Indigenous peoples is an absolutely integral part and aspect of international development. So perhaps to explain a little bit about One Just World, it's a national series which challenges us to think, talk, act on global poverty and development. It's a partnership between the Australian Government's Agency for International Development, AusAid, the International Women's Development Agency, World Vision Australia, and in each state there's a university partner. And for tonight's forum, we're very pleased to be joined by UNICEF Australia, by CARE Australia, and also by the University of Melbourne. And I'd also like to thank CBM, who's done the wonderful exhibition up the back. Now, One Just World is about providing a platform for ideas and discussion about important development and social justice issues and how these might be addressed, which is what we really want to look at tonight, to enable also you to question people directly here involved in these issues, make your own suggestions, and find out more about ways in which you can contribute and get involved. And incidentally, this morning I was at a breakfast and talked to a group of company directors, and immediately after it, someone emailed me to say, how can I contribute? So if any of you would like to do that after tonight, then please, you can email me, but more importantly, email the International Women's Development Agency or UNICEF or CARE Australia or Kim at World Vision. That would be one of the great successes of tonight's forum, is to have more and more people involved in global poverty and development. So we're delighted to see such a wonderful audience here for tonight's discussion, which is the recipe for eradicating poverty. Is there a missing ingredient? Perhaps just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. I'd like you to all put your mobile phones on silent, just on silent. You don't have to turn them off, because you're welcome to leave them on, because we want to encourage you to get involved in the conversation via Twitter, a la Q&A. Now the hashtag to use and follow is 1JW, which you can see on the screen. Also we will actually show the live Twitter feed as it comes through. So tonight we have a wonderful panel of experts to discuss some of the different issues that could inform us what the post-2015 development objectives might encompass and how they believe we've been tracking in relation to achieving the Millennium Development Goals by 2015. And what I'll do is introduce our panelists first, and then I'm going to ask them to give an opening discussion around, from their point of view, around the topic of tonight's discussion. If I could start on my far left with Rosangela Baumann-Bieler. She's the chief of the UNICEF Disability Section under the Gender Rights and Civic Engagement Program at UNICEF in New York. She's a Brazilian journalist who holds a master's degree on inclusion of persons with disabilities. She's been a disability rights advocate for more than 35 years, and she's first joined UNICEF recently in February 2001 as senior advisor on children with disabilities before moving across to her current role. She's also the co-founder of the Inter-American Institute on Disability and Inclusive Development, created to promote social, economic and political inclusion in the Latin American and Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa and Asia. So please welcome Rosangela Baumann-Bieler. On my immediate left is John Wan Yoon, who's World Vision's East Asia's Regional Program Manager of the End Trafficking in Persons program. John joined World Vision in 2001 when he worked as the Thai-Myanmar Border Trafficking Prevention Project Coordinator. It's a mouthful. Between 2005 and 2011, he worked again for World Vision, managing their first multi-country anti-trafficking project, the Mekong Delta Regional Trafficking Strategy Project. After this, John assumed his current role of Regional Program Manager for a new 5-year anti-trafficking program and is now based in Laos. Now, throughout these projects, John has worked to promote community-based prevention efforts, to develop peer education approaches to building life skills and self-protection skills for children and youth, and to provide protection services to victims of trafficking, especially when they've returned to life in their own communities, and also to contribute to improving government policies to combat trafficking in persons. Please welcome John Wan Yoon. Next to John is Julia Newton-Howes, who's the CEO of Care Australia, a role she's held since 2007. And in this role, Julia's been working to ensure that gender equality and women's empowerment are absolutely central to Care's programs. She's emphasised the importance of measuring the impact of Care's work, of improving systems to ensure effective use of funds, and of increasing understanding amongst Australians of the importance of supporting women in overcoming global poverty. Julia is on the board of Care International and is also Vice President of the Australian Council for International Development, ACFID. Julia was born in India. She spent her early life in Zimbabwe, leaving to attend Imperial College at London University, where she obtained both a bachelor's degree and a PhD in science. Please welcome Julia Newton-Howes. And last but not least, next to Julia is Brett Paris, who's the senior economist at the Australian Conservation Foundation. Now, as an economist, Brett is focused on the interactions between economic development, the environment, climate change, poverty, energy, and conflict. He's got a very strong interest in the political forces that impact on poor people, the legal underpinnings of these economic systems, and the roles of religion and spirituality in development. His background is in science, theology, development studies, and economics, and he currently works as the senior economist for the Australian Conservation Foundation and holds a research fellow role in the Department of Econometrics and Business Studies at Monash. Before this post that Brett currently holds, he worked for World Vision for almost 15 years, during which he coordinated World Vision's International's economic policy, their climate policy development, and led a team of economists and technical specialists at World Vision Australia. Please welcome Brett Paris. Now, the way we've organised tonight as a conversation covering a number of issues related to the Millennium Development Goals, I'm going to ask the panellists in a few minutes to briefly, in 5 minutes or less, talk a little bit more about their own work, their own perspective on tonight's issue. Then we'll have about 30 minutes of discussion, and then followed by your discussion, your questions, and there'll also be an opportunity for you to pose Twitter questions to the panellists. So keep that in the mind when the time comes. Not when the Twitter comes as well. But first, some background to tonight's conversation. A little bit about the Millennium Development Goals. In the year 2000, 189 nations commenced the new millennium with a promise to free people from extreme poverty. That was our promise as a globe. We would do this by addressing 8 key issues understood to perpetuate poverty. This pledge became the Millennium Development Goals, we now just call the MDGs. With a deadline set only a few years hence in 2015, these 8 goals encompass poverty and hunger, education, gender equality and women's empowerment, health, environmental sustainability and global partnership. There's a recent report, and it's actually, there's a very good summary from AusAid actually on your seat, that gives us a quick introduction or a quick summary of what's happened to date. And if I could give you some of these are really very heartening, but obviously, as we will discuss, there's still a long way to go. Extreme poverty is falling in every region, with the proportion of people living on less than $1.25 a day dropping from 47% in 1990 to 24% in 2008. The proportion of people without access to improved sources of water has halved. Many more of the world's children are enrolled in primary education, with a higher proportion of girls being included than was previously the case. The number of children dying before the age of 5 has significantly decreased, with strong progress continuing in this area. Access to treatment for people living with HIV has increased pretty dramatically. Tuberculosis incident rates have been falling, and globally, death rates from malaria have declined. So overall, the summary to date is that these results represent a reduction in suffering and improved living conditions in the lives of many people across the globe. But there's still an enormous amount of work to do. And with so many people around the world still struggling to feed their families, to access the basic necessities of life, and to exercise some of their fundamental human rights, there's obviously much more work to be done. Now, with the year 2015 fast approaching, the international community is now considering what to do next, what our development objectives beyond this date should actually look like. Some are happy with just keeping the 8 MDGs as they are. Others suggest that the existing framework falls well short of addressing the essentials required to eliminate extreme poverty. The proponents of this view argue that a 9th goal could fill this gap. Some advocate for a goal on disability as a focus area, facilitating global recognition, inclusion and support. Others demand an increased focus on violence against women, elimination of child exploitation, or tackling human trafficking. And what about war? An issue that by its very nature creates and proliferates poverty. Should we be putting a spotlight on conflict fueled by religion and race? Is there something missing that, if targeted, could offer a more holistic approach to overcoming poverty? And what should be made the highest priority, if anything? Which all comes down to one basic question: what does the world need to see in order to eliminate extreme poverty? So now I'd like to come back to our panellists and ask them to introduce, as I said before, for a 3 to 5 minute introduction, in terms of their work and their approach to these big issues about what next with respect to the MDGs. And if I can start with you, Brett, as an economist, can you maybe tell us a bit about what that encompasses, how economics are related to poverty, and what you see is really essential with the post-2015 agenda?
Thanks, Rob. Well, economics is basically about how societies use resources to produce the things that we need to flourish as human beings, and about how we produce a lot of junk that we don't need that works against human flourishing as well. So both are going on. It's about how societies move from poverty to prosperity, and also the risks of building that prosperity on sand, how we avoid those risks, how we recognise when we're taking those risks. So that's the whole sustainability dimension of it. Good economics can help guide good policy making, help us understand the pros and cons, the costs and benefits of different decisions. Bad economics can ruin whole societies and ruin the environment and cause extinctions. So economics is integral to this. It's not the only consideration, but it's an important one. What I think's missing? I suppose I'd focus on two aspects. One is protection of the most vulnerable. The MDGs didn't really do enough on this in terms of the social safety nets, particularly for children. Early childhood nutrition and development and education are critical. But also protecting the elderly, people with disabilities, people with mental illness, people in poor health, prisoners as well, missing. Protection of the most vulnerable is an absolutely critical aspect of poverty reduction and sustainable human well-being. But the other thing I focus on, of course, working for ACF, is sustainability. Sustainability is not an optional luxury. So fundamentally, the question we have is, would you build a castle on sand? It's no good us having these wonderful development plans, building these great civilizations, building our cities if the foundations are on sand, because it looks good for a while, but then inevitably it crumbles. And so that's the challenge we've got today. And I suppose the big challenge from my point of view, from our point of view, ACF, is seeing the separation of the poverty eradication from the environmental sustainability agenda. And I think what we're seeing is those two things coming together. I'll talk more about climate change and other things later, but that's probably enough to start.
You go for it. Okay, thanks very much, Brett. Rosangela, now perhaps I can ask you about the relationship between poverty and disability, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about your work in this area.
Sure. First of all, I'm sorry, I'm a little
cold.
I have the flu, just traveling too much. And I would like to start, I know it's not very polite to talk about oneself when you start talking about this, but I think that it's a good example. My personal story, I was born in Rio de Janeiro in a middle-class family, and I have a car accident when I was 18. And my family had the means to get me to rehabilitation, to education. I was in college already, and here I am today, right? I graduated, I had my master's, I got married after my accident, had my child, and traveled around the world. And I'm talking to you about the next development framework right now. And the reality is that if I was born in the same city, in one of the 10 favelas, slums that are right around my neighborhood in Rio, I would have lived only for 1 year. And this is an evidence of the relationship between poverty and disability. So it's a cycle that feeds itself, and we have the CBM exhibition here very nicely done about ending the cycle. And if you are a person with a disability, you have more costs of living, you have less education to health, less access to health, to education, to rehabilitation. If you live in a family of 5, normally the mother will have to take care of a child with a disability or even an elderly. And this person will be out of the job market, and it will be 2 people out of the job market in the same family. So poverty taking to disabilities because of lack of access, and disabilities taking more deeply into poverty because of more costs and less income and basically exclusion. So the cycle is clear. There are evidence that today we have 15% of the population, meaning 1 billion people with disabilities living around the world. At least 1 in 10 children have a disability, 80% living in developing countries. 100 million of these people got a disability due to malnutrition. And again, this is an evidence of the relationship between poverty and disability. So the cycle is pretty clear. We have been working not only to promote the issue of disability through the MDGs. The current one does not include disabilities, but in reality, it's the way you see things. You cannot reduce, you cannot eliminate poverty, or you cannot achieve universal education if you don't count people with disabilities in. For example, 1/3 of all the out-of-school children have a disability, and then you cannot achieve any goals if you don't include them. So I think that the main issue that we are facing right now is that we have so many competing issues, and we should not be competing among ourselves, for sure. We should be combining, and the only way of combining our agendas is really focusing on a society for all, and a society for all acknowledging diversity as part of what we are, as part of our identity, and building an inclusive world that everybody can live with the same rights and in equal opportunities. So for the next development framework, we think we are in UNICEF working very hard now on influencing the post-2015 agenda, having consultations around the globe, online consultations through the website, the inequalities consultation that UNICEF just held together with the UN Women had a focus on disabilities as one of the inequalities, and we are working with the disability movement, the International Disability and Development Consortium, and the International Disability Alliance, together with the other UN agencies, to make sure that disability is part of the next framework, but not necessarily only as a disability. We don't need the word there necessarily. We need inclusion, we need inclusive education, we need inclusive social protection, we need access to employment and to everything else. So basically this is the focus right now, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Rosangela. Thank you very much. Your message is the 3 I's: inclusion, inclusion, and inclusion. Julia, as CEO of Care Australia, your work's focused on poverty on a daily basis. What do you think are some of the driving forces that really do create extreme poverty?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And it's terrific to be here and see such a crowd of people interested in development issues and the Millennium Development Goals. The driving forces of poverty, I think we used to see poverty as a lack of stuff, not enough money, not access to school, and yes, those are issues, but really the driving force of poverty, and I think this came out of what you said, Rosangela, is inequality, disadvantage, discrimination. And you know what one of the key factors is in that inequality and disadvantage? It's actually whether you were born a boy or a girl. So there's lots of women here in the audience, and here in Australia, I'm sure you know that your salary right now, if you're working, will be less than a man's salary on average with a similar background. Your lifetime earnings as a woman are less on average than the lifetime earnings of a man in the audience here. And when you retire, your superannuation on average will be lower than a man's. Now, I imagine that everyone in the audience here would like to see that change. And clearly Australia is a wealthy country which actually has done reasonably well on a lot of gender discrimination indicators. When you transfer that into poor communities, into developing countries, I think some of the indicators are much starker. So what do we see? So in developing countries, women grow about 50% of the food that's consumed, but they own about 1% of the farmland. Actually, 70% of people who live in extreme poverty are female, women and girls. 2/3 of illiterate adults are women. So there's all these ways in which, because you were born a girl, so many choices are made for you. And so women are disadvantaged, and that sort of cultural norms create an unlevel, not a level playing field based on your gender. But we also know that when we do address the gender norms that create discrimination, when a woman does come out of poverty, on average, she brings 4 other people with her. And that's because actually, on average, women, compared to men, reinvest their resources, their assets, the money they control. They tend to reinvest that into their family at a higher level, and into their immediate community at a higher level than do men. So actually ensuring that women also have decision-making power within the family. Women also are able to control assets. Women's voices are heard when communities talk about their aspirations, their development goals. These things are fundamental to overcoming extreme poverty. So we won't overcome extreme poverty unless we also address the cultural norms that actually are holding back 50% of the world's talent, and relegating them to lower status positions.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. John, now you're working in the area of human trafficking. There are often misconceptions about this. Perhaps you could just give us a definition of it and tell us about how this does relate to poverty.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. I work on the trafficking issue in the Greater Mekong sub-region, and that is in Southeast Asia. And so I'll talk pretty much on what I see and observe in the work in that region. There are plenty of misconceptions about human trafficking, and so what I can do is maybe highlight a few of those. Sure. And in terms of the definition, I mean, essentially it's human beings harming other human beings and putting them into situations where there is a complete loss of control, loss of freedom, and loss of dignity. They use different methods to do that. There are means of control. They usually use some form of deceit, threat, force, or debt bondage in terms of victimizing various people. There is an element of movement, as most people can see in the term human trafficking. However, it doesn't always mean that there is a criminal from the point of origin all the way to the point of destination. There are many victims of trafficking where we have observed that they have actually begun the journey on their own, and they have crossed over to a neighboring country or to another location within their own country and end up being put into a trafficking situation where they have lost their control. What are some of the misconceptions? In terms of trafficking, I think there is a general idea that most of the trafficking is about the women and the children, and that they are to be pitied, they are to be helped as a matter of charity. But I think that's a bit of an erroneous position because, first of all, women and children are not objects of pity. And they have agency, and it is about helping them to actually be able to take back control over their lives. And at the same time, men are being trafficked as well. Sometimes we think that that just isn't happening, but that is happening quite a lot. And there is growing recognition now that there is a lot of men being trafficked into labor trafficking. So whether it is into the fishing boats or into unregulated factories or work in plantations or construction sites. The other common misconception is that it's all about sex, that it's about trafficking into sexual exploitation. That again, there's a growing recognition that that is not the case, and that trafficking is very much into labor trafficking as well. There are many men, women, and children being forced into situations where they have to labor and toil endlessly without pay, and no hope for being able to escape on their own. There may also be an idea that trafficking is controlled by highly organized criminal gangs, that there are syndicates very much involved in trafficking. What we are finding is that that's not necessarily the case. In countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, a lot of the criminals engaged in trafficking are not highly organized criminals. Sometimes they can be the boyfriend that sells his girlfriend into a brothel, or it can be an aunt, a relative, a trusted member of the family that actually enslaves one of her own relatives. And so there is no one profile for who the trafficker is, and so that makes it even more difficult to try and uproot this problem. Something else I'd like to highlight is that often people think that if there is a raid, the police actually bust up whoever is trafficking an innocent victim. Let's say a brothel is raided or a factory has been raided. We think that, okay, that's great, and we can send them back home, and that's the end of the story. We've done our part. But I'd like to say that the work actually continues, and maybe for the victim the work begins when that individual actually returns to community. That person has to adjust back to life in society, economically, physically, emotionally, socially. And the journey begins there, and the assistance that's often required isn't there. And that's something where I try to highlight as often as possible, because even within the many anti-trafficking players, the amount of work, the amount of funding that goes into helping a person reintegrate or adjust back to life in society is very minimal, and it is a neglected area of the work. And so I think those are some of the things I'd like to highlight in terms of the trafficking problem. Now, how is it related to poverty? I think most people might say, oh, of course it's very much related to poverty, because poverty is the cause of trafficking. And so here, I think it might be good to kind of change the language a little bit and say that poverty isn't the cause of trafficking per se, because it is the trafficker, the criminal, that is actually at fault and is the cause of the trafficking problem. However, we do need to recognize that the traffickers actually target the most vulnerable. They target the poor, they target the marginalized. And they target those that are at the bottom, those that cannot fight back, those that cannot argue, those that don't have a voice. So it's talking about people like those persons that are stateless. They don't have a nationality, they don't have citizenship, those that can't get jobs or can't migrate legally. It's about people that are not covered, that are falling through the gap in terms of the social safety network or social protection, and also those that are in violent and unstable homes. And so the backdrop in terms of from where do the traffickers actually bring the victims out, it is from those that are the most poor and the most marginalized.
Lovely, thanks, John. Now, perhaps I can ask of you all, I mean, tonight's theme around the recipe for eradicating poverty, is there a missing ingredient? And really looking at the MDGs, I won't say going forward, in the future. Perhaps I can ask the first question to you. I mean, in terms of the MDGs having been developed, have they actually addressed enough of the issues that you're particularly interested, that you've talked about tonight? You know, how well have we done so far? And then I'll ask you, well, where should we be going in the future with respect to a missing ingredient or missing ingredients? Julia.
Okay, well, can I just say that I think the MDGs have been a really good rallying point. You know, there was a sense in which everything was important in aid, and so we were doing lots of things. But the MDGs have done a few things. Firstly, by covering income poverty, health, education, gender equality, and environmental sustainability, and also the way we give aid, I think the MDGs have recognised that it's a much more complex picture around poverty and development issues. And they have provided a rallying call so that donors, governments have focused on measuring progress in some really key and important areas. So things like universal primary education and gender parity within universal primary education. So overall, I'm a real fan of the MDGs. Were they perfect? No. So I think we can come on to that.
Got an MDG fan.
I'll comment. I can just comment on the
sure,
environment
please.
one, MDG 7. I mean, it was a mixed bag with MDG 7 on the environment. I mean, it included biodiversity, which we're clearly failing at. We're instituting a mass extinction at the moment. It covered drinking water and sanitation in urban slums, but it missed climate change, it missed water depletion, it missed land degradation, it missed oceans, food security, sustainable agriculture, access to energy. And it said nothing at all about developed countries' responsibilities to reduce unsustainable consumption. So there's some big gaps.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Brett. Rosanna.
As I said, the MDGs, the current ones, don't include disabilities, but in reality, I think that just putting it in perspective a little bit, after the MDGs were created, and the gap was clear on disability, many things started to happen in terms of disability and development. The World Bank started talking about disability and development and put things together. Now, after 13 years, even safeguards are being discussed on disability and inclusion. Even social inclusion, that was not an issue at all. Now it's so much clear. Good. And the basic development for us, which was the development of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, that started to be shaped and negotiated in 2001. It was adopted in 2006 and entered into force in 2008. Now 125 plus countries already ratified. So I think that during these 15 years, disability started to become part of the development agenda, and I really hope that this was lesson learned for the development sector and for the disability sector as well, to make sure that inclusion becomes part of the next one. So I'm a big fan of the MDGs too. I learned everything that I know about development, I think, because of the MDGs, and hopefully we are ready to move forward.
Well, okay, so the question now is, well, where to? You four are deciding what next, the 2015 agenda. It's all on you guys. Where are you going to take this? Who wants to open the bidding? John, you go for it.
Sure. I agree very much with what Julie was saying before. In terms of the MDG having been a rallying call, it's been a global compact that people have been able to really get behind and have a push for it. And we can see that there has been progress made in many areas, even though, as has been noted, there have been many things left out. There have been many things that have been less than perfect. Now, in terms of the areas such as extreme poverty and hunger, I think it would be good to look at how do we draw out some of the nuances in terms of reducing extreme poverty and hunger, because most of the reporting is at the national level. And I think there would be value in looking at how can we actually look deeper than that, because there are inequalities within countries, and there are those that are still being left out. And again, how do we actually get down to those that are at the bottom, those that are the poorest, the most vulnerable, so that they don't continue to get hidden or neglected as a result of having these national level statistics that may actually mask some of the problems that are still persistent. The other point I would make is in terms of primary education, perhaps we need to look at something beyond primary education. Can we include something higher than that? Can it be secondary education as well? Because what we often see is a lot of kids drop out after completing primary school. And where do they go? And we actually do see many of those that are victimized by trafficking are those that have left and they find no other alternative. They've been looking around. Very limited opportunities or options in terms of further education at the secondary level or a viable job. And that's when they turn to very risky options, which can often end themselves up in a trafficking situation.
Rob, can I follow on from that?
Yep.
You know, and building on this recipe for eradicating poverty, is there a missing ingredient? You know, when you cook something, it's not just about the ingredients you assemble, it's also how you mix them together. And I would say, we've got to keep a small number of MDGs so that we can, so that we can see the picture. Yeah, that's right. And ugly recipe, you're taking this a bit too far. But so I think it's also how we mix it together. And so on gender equality, it's sitting there in MDG 3 and there's a bit of women's health, MDG 5. But I think if we're going to address discrimination against women, we've got to really look in all the goals. How do we incorporate equality, gender equality, address the issues of the marginalisation of people with disabilities? So I think it's not so much a missing ingredient, it's how we put the recipe together. And can I just also say that for me, right now we live in a world which has a global economy that is worth $70 trillion. And the Brookings Institute has estimated that if we were to take all that 1 billion plus, just over 1 billion people who live under $1.25 a day, so that's everyone who lives in extreme poverty, it would take $66 billion to create a social safety net that would bring everyone out of extreme poverty. So in a $70 trillion economy, that's just under 0.1% of the global economy. 1/10 of 1% of the global economy, we could eradicate extreme poverty. And I think that's a really important message. This is actually within our grasp. It's about political will. And, I think that if we imagine a global social safety net that no one will fall below, I'd also then endorse Brett's point that you need also to be realistic about the external limits of the world in terms of sustainability. So people, I think it's a bit of a flippant comment, but we've got recipes here. So people talk about donut economics, you know, and if you imagine a donut, here's the outer limits to growth, and here's the inner ring that the gap, no one will fall below this. So maybe it's a recipe for a donut.
Lovely, I love it. Okay, Rosangela, yeah.
Yes, I just think that something that is important always to consider is that we cannot miss a human rights approach to the development framework. Of course, equality, sustainability are key issues, but even when we plan for systems that are comprehensive, many times inequalities still persist. So I think that it's very important to pay attention, because when you have big social protection systems, you have all the excluded around it, outside it, and it repeats in everything that we decide that this will be what we will focus in. So I think that it's fine to focus on goals, but they have to be comprehensive and take into consideration all the aspects of humanity, right? Disability, for example, is a cross-cutting issue. It should not fit under one goal, for example, but it's what we say in UNICEF every day. The child that is in the center has all these faces: a gender face, a disability face, an indigenous, a migrant, you know, a refugee, and all these faces. So when we plan for development, sustainable development, inclusive development, we have to take into consideration all of them, because that's what we don't know how to do yet. So.
Brett.
Well, I find myself in furious agreement with the other speakers on all these things. I suppose, if I may, I might just say a little bit about climate change and why I think it's so important to marry the MDG agenda with the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll just read a short quote from the International Energy Agency from last April. It says, "We have a responsibility and a golden opportunity to act. Energy-related CO2 emissions are at historic highs. Under current policies, we estimate that energy use and CO2 emissions would increase by 1/3 by 2020 and almost double by 2050. This would likely send global temperatures at least 6 degrees higher. Such an outcome would confront future generations with significant economic, environmental, and energy security hardships." That last bit is something of an understatement. 6 degrees higher, it's very hard for us to grasp, but 5 degrees below where we are now is what kind of gave us the ice ages. So 5 degrees below where we are doesn't mean you kind of need an extra coat when you go out. It means, you know, you might have a mile of ice over your house. 6 degrees above where we are now, the Earth hasn't seen for about 50 million years. It took millions of years to get to that point, and it took millions of years to cool down from that point. So our entire human civilization, our entire evolution as a species has never seen those kinds of temperatures at all. 50 million years ago, horses standing on this table would be about this tall. You know, we've moved a long way since then. All our ecosystems have evolved to temperatures much lower than that. In geological terms, 6 degrees above where we are now in 100 years is essentially a vertical line straight up. Our ecosystems, our civilization cannot possibly adapt to that. There's two, I think, critical aspects of the climate change thing that are not well enough appreciated. One is the scale of the threat, you know, the 6 degrees. The other one is the urgency of the threat, and there's three aspects to that. One is that there's time lags in the system, the climate system. We've had 0.8 degrees already. We've got at about another 0.6 degrees coming because of what we've already put into the atmosphere, so we're guaranteed about 1.4 degrees. We've got momentum in the system as well. And natural processes start to take over once you get past a certain level. So we've got about 1 trillion tonnes of carbon locked up in the Arctic Circle. Once that gets past a certain point and starts melting and decomposing, it's kind of game over in terms of that. The other one aspect is that there's a narrow window of opportunity to do something about this. And that window of opportunity will pass before we start to see the really serious effects. And that's the unbelievably difficult political and psychological problem for us. The best analogy perhaps is to imagine, well, not the best, but one I come up with anyway, is imagine that you're driving like a fully laden semi-trailer down a mountain road, like you're carrying steel girders or something like that. You're on a 22-wheeler, you're driving down a mountain road, and you see a bend coming up. Now, if you don't want to go over the edge, you've got to brake well before you're in that bend. If you want to wait till you're in the bend before you're really sure it's a bend, there's nothing you can do at that point. The time for braking has a narrow window of opportunity, and that's, in climate change terms, that's the next 5 to 10 years. So if we let this run away from us, it will comprehensively undo the MDGs, undo our systems of governance, undo our capacity for food security and water security. So, yeah, critical and urgent.
Thanks very much, Brett. We're going to just now have a slight change of pace. And what we're going to do, given that we've been having lots of great tweets, e-tweets, what I'm going to get you to do is do p-tweets, which is to talk to each other for 2 minutes, a personal tweet. Just if you can talk to each other for 2-3 minutes, you can get up if you like, but talk to each other about what are the key issues that have been raised tonight, and then we'd love you to ask those questions to the panel. So you now have 3 minutes and p-tweet each other. Okay, we might ask you to, who's got some questions for the panel? You're lucky enough to be standing right next to me, so if you speak into my cheek, they can hear you. It's going to be quicker.
My question to the panel is, what role does the education of learners in developed countries have in these issues of all that you've mentioned tonight, issues of gender equality, disability, trafficking? What role does the education of learners in developed countries have to play?
In developing countries or developed?
I don't think you can quite grab onto that one.
Sorry?
Did you want to?
I can comment quickly.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
I mean,
Australian students. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, when I was teaching at Monash, we ran a course for economists and made sure that we taught these economic students some real stuff about climate systems and food systems and complex systems, that there are thresholds and non-linear effects and all this kind of stuff, that the real world is complicated and you don't make good policy with nice, simple little toy models. You've got to understand some of the complexity and be open to insights from other disciplines. So.
And Australia is one of the most globalised countries in the world. Our economy is intimately connected with the economies of other countries. Unlike, the UK or France, we're surrounded by developing countries. So, more than most other developed countries, I think it's critical that Australians understand development in a nuanced way, that they recognise the issues that affect Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, will ultimately also affect Australia. So our future is linked to the future. In a globalised world, these interconnections really matter. So I think it's a terrific question, and we do need to understand the world better.
Thanks. Who's got? Please, down here. Just coming to you right now.
Here?
Anybody else put your hands up if you want to? Good? Oh, good. Oh.
Hi, I just wanted to add to the question asked first. Australia, I think, has the highest level of food waste in the world, if I'm not mistaken, and educating the educated, in my view, would be more important to eradicate poverty around the world. So please comment.
Yeah, it comes to this: what are the limits to growth in an interconnected world? If we're wasting and utilising things unwisely, it impacts on all of us. Yeah.
What I did want to say, related to both the questions, is that in terms of education or the educated in the developed world, I think it's important, as interconnected as we are globally, that we need to have greater consciousness as global citizens rather than as Australians or a citizen of another country, because I think there is a real need for young people to actually get involved in the dialogue in terms of what is happening in the MDGs, but also what is happening after this. And so I think for Australians, it's important to really get involved in the dialogue, but not only here, but to actually become conscious of the fact that those that are in developing countries also need to have platforms and channels and opportunities to actually input into all of the discussions, dialogues, consultations that go into what will happen in terms of post-2015.
Please.
My question relates back onto what you were just speaking about. So how do you empower the communities that you work with to discover what changes they need to accomplish and empower them with the tools so they can work towards to make the changes for their community?
Well, I think that I did not hear the question very well, but I think just in the context of when we talk about education, I think that's something that is very important too, is to consider civic engagement and participation, because sometimes only education will not make it. I think it's awareness that we are talking about, and how we understand that we are building a world for everybody, because what happens there will impact what happens here as well. So just taking the example of disability, I think that, again, you have to do at home what you believe is good for others and walk the talk. And in this case here in Australia, what we see is that even through the negotiation of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the disability organizations in Australia were very, very, very important for the development of the Convention. And today, USAID is the main donor on disability in the world. Yep. It's a leader on disabilities, and not only through AIDS, but through empowerment of persons with disabilities. So I think that it has to be more than only education. It's education for development and for understanding what really impacts our own lives from the individual to the global and vice versa. So.
Lovely, thanks very much. Up the back.
All right. I believe during the discussion, the number $66 billion was raised for eradicating poverty. Now, to me, that seems to be a number that is easily possible to be raised. So that should be at the disposal of the NGO community. So do you think that the money is inefficiently used, or is there something systematic at work which is difficult to capture?
Okay, so can I pick that up?
That's a $66 billion question, sorry.
So globally, aid is about $120 billion a year. I'm sorry, haven't got the latest figure because it's been trending down in the last year or two from all OECD countries. So clearly the money is there. I think this is a thought experiment to give us a sense of what would it take to have a global social safety net that would take people up. You know, when you live on $1.25 a day, you still feel poor. But when you live below that, that is the most extreme and difficult form of poverty. So clearly this is a thought experiment. But we know that countries like Brazil, for example, and it's being experimented with in India, are really looking at innovative ways through mobile phone money, through social safety nets, to really implement programs like this that provide people. I mean, this isn't an easy living, but with a basic level. So I think, you know, is it practical? Clearly there'll be a lot of complications in actually making this work. But I think as a thought experiment, when we need to grasp how big the world economy is, and really how little it would be required to bring people up. And I think we need to use these numbers, you know, to shame our government, to shame all governments in saying, extreme poverty can be eradicated, and let's use we have modern technology to really find a way to make this happen. And certainly it's happening in some countries, but it's not yet anything like universal.
Thank you. Please, here.
Yes, I'd like to make some comment on global warming. In 1967, I was living in northern British Columbia in Canada, and I got a pilot's license. I flew past, in my routine route we flew, I flew past 2 glaciers. They were in very, very substantial retreat, had been sort of long before people arrived, humanity or any sort of industrialisation arrived on the scene. And the geological view at the time was that there'd been global warming for 50,000 years. Now, for people now to turn around and start talking about what happened last week or 5 years ago, I think it's damn meaningless.
Thank you. Anybody? Brett, did you?
Take it as a comment. I mean,
yeah.
You know, you can agree with an anecdote, or you can look at what all the national academies of science around the world are saying. I mean, it's a matter of who you believe and who you trust.
Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, about what you're talking about the money. So I imagine if you got, say, a campaign and everyone starts to give 0.1% of the salary and income, and then we have the 66 billions. So how this approach with all the governments, do you think it's able to talk with all the governments and then all the countries really use the money in the right way?
Use it in the right way. Can I take this one too? Look, there are problems with corruption and inefficiency in most governments, some more than others. Some it's serious. But also, for a lot of these countries, they just simply don't have enough resources. The economist Jeffrey Sachs gave a speech a few years ago where he talked about Malawi. And he talked about how much the government is actually able to raise in taxes from the people and what that means for their budget. And so he said, for Malawi, I can't remember the exact figures, but it would be equivalent if Australia had to run its entire state apparatus on the budget of Melbourne University. So the police, the army, the judiciary, all levels of government, state, local, federal, the health service, the education service, everything, on about $1 billion. Yeah, that would be what the kind of comparable situation we're talking about. So, yeah, you can eliminate corruption, you can have perfect public servants, you can have hyper-efficiency. You couldn't possibly run Australia on the budget of Melbourne University, and that's the situation a lot of these poorest countries are facing.
Question here, and then you still up the back there? Yep. We'll carry to you. Yep.
So my question to the panel is, in terms of the ingredient, I guess, the missing ingredient to the recipe, do you feel that the interrelatedness of the different issues are being undermined, and that is there any way that we could emphasize that more and we could see that by helping one of the issues that we're also helping the relating issues as well? Thanks.
Nice question. Yeah. I mean, you started to address this in your discussion, Rosangela, so you might want to...
Yes, well, basically, I think it's not, I think, the main ingredient and no recipes for sure for this kind of things, but I think that ingredients, the main ingredient is to keep the vision where the vision should be, and I think that the vision should be really in valuing life, diversity, and making sure that society is built for everybody and the environment as well. I think that this is a vision, and when we have the vision, everything else follows. So I think that that's what we cannot miss at this point.
And Rob, can I just add really quickly, because also there was a question about how do you work to empower communities. I think that one aspect that was really missed in the original MDGs was consultation. And, you know, they were written, Jeffrey Sachs has admitted, they were written by 12 people sitting in the basement of the UN building in New York. And this process that is being led by the UN at the moment, where there are global meetings going on, where there are national consultations happening. I was lucky enough to attend a meeting on this in East Timor a few weeks ago, where one of the ministers of the government of East Timor said, you know, the people who need to have the biggest say in the next lot of MDGs are the ones who have benefited least from this round of MDGs. So I think that issue of listening to voices, you know, this is, you know, it's a human rights issue. People's own aspirations count in what they want to see from development.
Thanks, Julia. 4 more questions. There, and then pink and red. Sorry. I'm not colour biased. Generally speaking, sorry.
This has been touched on, but I was just wondering what the panellists think of how important and what priority it should be for our Australian government to increase its foreign aid contribution to 0.7% in the near future.
It's terribly important. Are you going to take the...
Yeah, no, you go.
You know, we are a wealthy country, and as I said before, we're surrounded by developing countries. So, you know, we have the luxury to be able to, we've been the country least affected by the global economic crisis. We just have the opportunity to both look after Australians and to play a leadership role in aid and development. I think it's part of being a good international citizen. The fact we got a seat on the UN Security Council and we're hosting the G20 in 2014, we're a respected country. We better live up to that by, you know, having an aid program that, you know, gives us that stature of being a good international citizen.
Great answer. Please.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for the speakers. At the beginning of the forum, we spoke about what we've done right with MDGs, but we didn't speak about what we're way off track, and that's definitely been around women and children's health. So I guess I have a real plug for going forward for after 2015 that we don't forget the women and children's health.
Okay. Sorry, the next one was right up the, keep going up, warmer, 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 hot.
Pink. Thank you very much.
Pink, there you are, good.
You've been talking a lot about imagination and how you can imagine a better future and a better way of helping people. And I'm wondering where or if creativity and the idea of creative practice and creative thinking can be incorporated as one of the missing ingredients as a way of opening up the way we think and the possibilities more than what you're already doing tonight.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you go, Bert, and then John.
I was wondering whether to drop this in at the end. I'm so glad you raised it, because I think creativity and innovation are essential, but they also need a culture that nurtures that, and that culture has to include compassion, forgiveness, the ability to be vulnerable, a culture of not shaming people and tearing people down. I mean, I think if everyone is anyone like me, I think we're probably all heartily sick of the tone of political and public debate in this country of just shredding people. I mean, you can't have a sensible policy discussion. You can't have creative solutions emerge if people think that if they put themselves out there and are genuinely present and authentic and creative, they're going to get torn to shreds. I mean, that it all feeds on itself. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And so I think one of the missing things is, I guess, personal psycho-spiritual development. That's got to be a part of it as well. Now, you can't put that in an MDG and measure it, but
we could.
You're absolutely right. It's critical.
The spiritual MDG, I think. Please. Yes?
I think there's been some really valuable discussion tonight, but I wonder, how do we change the language from governments and systems changing to we, the individuals in the developed countries, changing the way we consume? Our consuming behaviour is impacting land use, water quality, and all those other things around regimes, giving them power through our consumer behaviour. We as individuals need to take responsibility, and we need to change that language and stop putting it upon our governments and other larger systems. How do we achieve that?
Well, I think the idea of donut economics is that actually it can be applied at any level. Because if you think of the limits to consumption, you can actually apply it at an individual level. You can apply it at a community level, you can apply it at a country level, and you can apply it globally. So I think, I hope, and I was going to say this in my summing up, that I hope in the next round of, so you've pinched it, I won't have to say anything to say, but I hope in the next round of MDGs we do, you know, the first round was really about developing countries. The second round needs to be about all of us in this together.
I'll just ask a question on behalf, a tweet on behalf of Lindsay Tallarico. Can you provide an example of an organisation or movement or individual that has helped meet the MDGs? I need something tangible to think about. Thanks, Lindsay. Lindsay?
I think all the organisations that are represented on this panel have got really tangible examples. Last year, Care Australia published our Asia Impact Report, and that was a summary of all the evaluations that we had done of projects that had been carried out in the Asia region over a 5-year period. And through that, we can point to, you know, we helped 10 million people improve their income. We helped, I can't remember all the numbers, but we improved health services to 9 million people in Asia and the Pacific. You know, those numbers add up. We know that across the world, poverty is declining, although there are, you know, there are entrenched inequalities. So, yeah, I'm sure other people have got lots of examples of where we can point you for really tangible work in that area.
Yeah. Here we go, please.
Hi. Tonight we've talked quite a bit about the about the environmental and social aspects of sustainability, but I just wanted to ask a question about the economic dimension of sustainable development, in terms of what we can do to, in the post-2015 agenda, how it can be structured in order to be able to leverage aid that's put in through the post-2015 agenda to create sustainable economic development for countries who are recipients of that aid.
Do you want to start?
That had the words economic development and sustainability.
Yeah,
therefore, it's your question.
Ends up in my lap. Yeah, well, there's a lot of different things going on. I mean, there's sort of clean energy financing systems in place in the climate change space. There's climate adaptation funding that is sort of coming on stream. I mean, it's not enough anywhere, but you're really right to point to the economic dimension of this issue. If I can very briefly, I want to give you 3 numbers that Bill McKibben from 350.org organisation put in an article in Rolling Stone magazine last year. It's drawn from the peer-reviewed literature, but he distills it into 3 neat numbers. One is the 2-degree number, which we can't go above without kind of wreaking havoc. That's the first number. The second number is the amount of carbon dioxide we can release between now and 2050 to give us a good chance of staying under that. And that's about 565 billion tonnes. That's our budget that we can burn through. That's the space that is available that has to be divided up between rich and poor countries to, who can emit those emissions. The third number is 2,795 billion tonnes, which is 5 times our budget. And that is the amount of CO2 that would be released if we burnt currently existing fossil fuel reserves. So what they're basically saying is that already we have 5 times as much oil and gas and coal on the books of fossil fuel companies as scientists say can be safely burnt. So what the implication of that is that there is a very, very big carbon bubble in the world financial system. Those assets are valued at about $27 trillion. Scientists are saying about 80% of it can't be burnt, or else we tip ourselves into the abyss. So that's a problem, and that's a pretty significant sort of economic dimension of this whole thing that needs to be sorted out somehow.
Great, thank you. Our last question comes from a tweeter with the absolutely delightful name of Happy Travel Bug. How would you like to see corporate Australia contribute to MDG achievement beyond donations and sponsorships?
Fabulous question.
Sorry?
Fabulous question. I mean, You know, I think many of our major corporate companies are multinationals, that they're operating in developed countries, developing countries, and being a good employer in a developing country, ensuring that you're offering worthwhile jobs with a decent rate of pay is, you know, I mean, clearly a really important route out of poverty is to get a decent job. So, and I think, you know, really understanding when you're using supply chains with a whole lot of messy subcontracting, make sure, you know, I think behaviour as a responsible citizen, make sure you really understand how those supply chains are working. And then, you know, they've got to care about their sustainability. There's lots of, there's a range of frameworks that exist, principles for sustainable development that a lot of our major corporates have signed up to, and they need to be accountable for that. So CSR is actually, you know, corporate social responsibility and donating money for development projects is really only a very small part of how our corporate companies are affecting development in the world. And I think it's really important to see a much bigger picture around it.
Lovely, thank you. Now for the wrap-up time, we're just about finished, and I just wanted to ask each of our 4 speakers in 140 characters or less to in a sense, provide us with what they think are the key messages that they may have even given us already. But please, John.
150 words? How many sentences is that?
Characters, mate. Oh. Counts gaps as well.
Right. I'd like to really stress the need for children and youth to be participating in the consultations, and that's both in developed and developing countries. I think that's absolutely key, and that needs to be pushed. We need to address the inequalities in the development because there's macro level development, but there's also micro level where we need to actually get down into those depths to separate out the inequalities. I think we also need to look at population dynamics. Because we're such a globalized society, a lot of the economics is about mobile populations, and it is within this context that a lot of the trafficking happens as well. And so I think population dynamics could be quite important as a consideration for post-2015.
Thanks, John. Julia.
So I want to come back to gender equality and women's empowerment. We won't overcome poverty unless we address the cultural norms, the harmful cultural norms that mean that when there's a major economic downturn in the world, more girl babies die than boy babies. It's horrific that any children are dying, but that girls are more likely to be malnourished than boys. Girls are more likely to be out of school. Women don't have access to economic opportunities, and you know, cultural practices that mean that women, you know, you're widowed at 18 in a country like Niger, but you won't inherit your husband's property. So those sorts of norms are trapping women in poverty. That's why 70% of people living in poverty are female, and we need to systematically address those harmful cultural norms, which, by the way, don't only harm women, they also harm boys and men.
Mm. Thanks, Julia. Britt?
Well, I suppose I would just say that I think the poverty and sustainability issues are absolutely inseparable. We're not going to solve poverty without sustainability. We're not going to solve sustainability without dealing with poverty. I just want to finish by quoting Vuk Jeremic, who's the current president of the UN General Assembly. He said this last week: to safeguard the world from runaway climate change, we need to decouple economic growth from our dependence on carbon-based energy systems. I see no other effective option on the horizon. Continuing to build the global economy on fossil fuels would likely destroy our hopes to achieve sustainability. I think he's right, but I also want to end on a note of hope. And hope doesn't come from denial. Hope comes from taking seriously the scale and the urgency of the threat we're facing, and then looking for solutions. And they are there, and we can reach it if we act together.
Thank you. Rosangela.
I would like to focus on inclusive development again, an inclusive approach to development as being the way forward again. I would reinforce the importance of consulting with children, adolescents, and youth, and with other marginalized groups too. We normally use this motto, nothing about us without us, that in reality came from the women's movement and the disability movement and children's movement. And in reality, what is really missing there is to have the voices of the ones that we are designing for being part of the process, from design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. So persons with disabilities are in the same context of gender, children, adolescents, and so many other groups. So when we talk about the root causes of poverty, stigma and discrimination play a very important role, also social norms and cultural norms, and we have to take this into consideration as well, and plan for bringing all these voices to the table and have, again, a development agenda that can incorporate everybody, not through isolated actions and programs, but into the core of development in everything we do.
Thank you, Rosangela. Now, this has been the 64th One Just World Forum. We hope that you are able to leave here tonight with a deeper and richer understanding of the dynamics and influences contributing to the perpetuation of extreme poverty, and what can and what will be done to assist people faced with such challenges. Now, just before you go, 3 things to keep in mind. One is keep the conversation going. You can do this on Twitter using the 1JW hashtag, by following us using @OneJustWorld, or on our Facebook page, where there'll be a conversation following on from tonight's discussion. The video of tonight's forum and the whole One Just World series is also on the website, where you can leave comments. It's easy to remember, onejustworld.com.au. Number 2, have a chat with the people at the tables in the entrance. They can tell you more about some of the great work being carried out around the world. And if you want to contribute, then contact one of the organisations. On their behalf, please contact them. And the forms on your seats will also give you some good tips on how to get involved. And thirdly, please take a moment if you can. I know this is a pretty boring thing to do, but fill out the evaluation form. Why? Because we get to know how to do this better. So please, it's another way to share your thoughts and ideas. 3 groups to thank. Can you please thank Kim and Tilly and the mic people. And the sound guys and the camera guys as well. So thank you very much. And AusAid and IWDA and CARE and World Vision and UNICEF and the University of Melbourne for putting this on. And lastly, our wonderful speakers, Rosangela Berman-Bieler, Julia Newton-House, Brett Paris, and John Wan Hun.